Next, Professor Rachel Julian from Leeds Beckett University on, I hope the title's still right, Community-Led Protection from Violence in Mindanao, how civilians are using non-violence to be more secure.
Yes, that is more or less the title. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is, thank you very much. It's great to be here and to be with sort of other people also sort of trying to explore different scenarios and ways of thinking about both pacifism and non-violence and different, well, from different perspectives, really. Really happy to be here. So the work I'm going to talk about today is, so it's from some co-designed research that we've been doing in Mindanao in the Philippines with community-led protection. They use unarmed civilian protection, which I'll discuss more in a while, to basically use non-violence to create more safety and security there. But using that as a way of thinking about how the role of non-violence within the way we create peace and security. So in Mindanao, just to give you a bit of sort of like background and thinking in the Philippines, about 20 years ago, civil society members supported by sort of various NGOs began to organise to actively monitor and proactively engage with the armed actors. There's sort of like there's been ongoing political violence and community violence, and they're particularly organised around the violations to the ceasefire arrangements, which were harming civilians. People were being caught up in, as armed actors were breaking ceasefire agreements in terms of moving troops or attacks at various places. And the work that they tried to do, and they trained people, they organised and set up their own mechanisms. The work involved sort of like having these conversations with soldiers. So very much sort of like it really linked to like a lot of Molly's ideas around actually engaging with the soldiers. That actually, if you talk with the soldiers and remind them about their humanity, they're all from the same area. They're all live there. They have family and experiences. So they're trying to explain that there are civilians in the line of fire of what soldiers are doing on the front line, that these people who are maybe in a market that's going to be attacked or something like that might well be their own friends and family, and so asking soldiers to re-engage. And that's a really non-violent approach to thinking about sort of like the rehumanizing of people. They also, as the sort of organised civilians, their groups of monitoring, they were logging the incidents and then reporting them widely, and that enabled civilians and communities to take action, so they could actually decide where they're going to run or hide or go to some of the safe spaces that were being created. They organised to have peace zones, places where they had conversations about that there not being weapons, about it being a space where people could go regardless of background. And they did this work, and it is explicitly non-violent. So it's not just they were civilians who didn't have weapons. They chose to do it in a way in which they were building relationships and dialogue. And the civilians themselves, by doing this, actually gave themselves more of a say in the peace process, and eventually, as we'll see, contributed to the official peace process in the Philippines that they were part of. And so they've been doing this work. They've been training people. I mean, they've trained thousands of people in terms of holding armed actors to account. So if the armed actors have agreed to something, it's now no longer just an official process of other military holding them to account. This is actually engaged civil society and civilians to understand the limits of what the armed actors should be doing, and finding ways of engaging with them and asking them to halt violence towards other civilians. The creating of safer space, so they've created either sort of a place that civilians can flee to, the idea that you can have a space where armed actors are and weapons are not welcome, and things like that. This is making it safer for people. And for us, as looking and thinking about the role of nonviolence, it helps us understand that there is a specific role for nonviolence in creating peace and security. So in this talk, I really want to think about the significance of the work that they're doing in places like Mindanao, also Myanmar, Iraq, South Sudan, Colombia, loads of places around the world. But think of the significance of this work as explicitly non-violent, and that it employs components of non-violence in order to work. So being dialogue, relationship building, and such. And that studying the work in Mindanao, if we were only to look at it as a civil society action in terms of community organizing or sort of like some other construct, in a sense, we're missing out on developing a deeper knowledge of what is the role of nonviolence in playing in what is becoming the everyday life for people in these communities. So very often we look at peace agreements or civil society monitoring actions and things like that. We look at it through a lens of peace and security. So I'm going to think about what happens if we put the frame of nonviolence into the way we think about peace and security. It's quite absent, largely absent in the analytical frameworks for peace and security. And so going to think about that. So some time ago, Richard Jackson wrote an article about whether resistance studies could save peace studies. And I think part of this argument is thinking still about peace studies and the way we think about peace and security, and bringing in an explicit frame of nonviolence to understand what needs to happen if we're going to go from war to peace or rethink militarism, and people are trying to reconstruct and contested ideas of security. So, for example, in peace studies, these sort of like dominant Galtung triangles of peace, violence, and conflict are still sort of like very entrenched in the idea that in order to create peace, we need peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. And interestingly, all of these do contain non-violent elements. So the dialogue is necessary in peacemaking. And dialogue is sometimes framed sort of like within non-violence as one of the key, a very radical act. So the idea from non-violence and anti-militarism work that you should dialogue with terrorists is a radical act within that. So the idea that dialogue is central to peacemaking, of bringing people together, is part of that. But also, if you're thinking about long-term peace building, the need to rebuild trust, to rehumanize and integrate communities together is very much part of thinking about do we recognize the humanity? Can we overcome the othering that happens, which is sort of like part of thinking about how we want the society to be constructed. And in peacekeeping, it's overwhelmingly been dominated by armed protection strategies, but the work in Mindanao and in other places using unarmed civilian protection is about using non-violence in order to protect other civilians. So there's also now a non-violent component to the peacekeeping part of that triangle. So there's also like the hourglass model, which in which tries to argue that when there is a war, the space for action, peaceful things, non-violence, is very small, but it doesn't say it's not there. So although we're used to examining the peaceful and non-violent actions that we can take when a society is more peaceful, maybe when there's sort of like only emerging levels of that, we can also talk about as violence increases or decreases, we can still talk about there being non-violent actions, might reduce, but they don't disappear. But there's also work of people like Diana Francis, and she talks about sort of like how the large international peace building projects, they cannot succeed unless we tackle the militarism, which is damaging to the peace work. And in order to do that, if we're going to challenge militarism, we need to be actively recognizing the contribution of nonviolence, not as some passive thing, but as having its own constructive power, and of enabling and motivating communities to do the work of creating peace and creation of a new peace future. And obviously sort of like this creating a new future we want is the creative, constructive, sort of like in Gandhian terms of non-violence. What I continue to find surprising in all this is how much of our peace and conflict scholarship talks about how to create peace without any reference to non-violence. And although that we critique militarism, and we look for sort of like how militarism is leading us to violence and war, and sometimes sort of seeing that militarism is obviously present and that's the real world that we have to deal with. I think there is a recognition. There should be a recognition that non-violence and pacifism are also there. They are active within the way which we create peace and security. And so it's helpful if in this grand project of moving from war to peace, that we actually see non-violence and pacifism equally part of the analysis and the way we're going to look for that. So my intention is that if we ignore non-violence and don't look for it, we don't acknowledge that there are many peace activities and activists and other people emerging and using principles of non-violence. If we miss that out, we're missing out on the fact that non-violence is also part of the real world, the ways in which civilians and activists are creating what they want. It explains why civil society and some institutional processes are leading towards peace, because they're actually using process of non-violence, which in itself is transformative. So that means anybody who's employing active listening or dialogue between those in conflict, people who are rehumanizing and acknowledging that there is no other and trying to bring those together, that we're all connected, they're using non-violent principles in there. And if in peace studies we start looking for non-violence, then hopefully we'll start finding it, and that will become part of the analytical frame that we're trying to construct. So back to Mindanao, the civilians are carrying out the work that they're doing in terms of making it safer for people, using unarmed civilian protection. And this is the model of how it works. It's a set of practices and approaches in which civilians are using non-violence and acknowledging the agency and capacity of the local communities to protect one another from direct violence without the use of weapons, therefore challenging the assumption that the only way you tackle violence is with violence or with the military. It's in Mindanao, it's very interesting because it's the first time that civilians to do some of the sort of like civilian protection work have been explicitly included in a formal peace agreement. It's normally a role for the military. So I also use the term nonviolent peacekeeping, subverting the dominant way in which we think about protecting civilians from being killed and raped and displaced, because the dominant way is armed peacekeeping, but changing the behavior of armed actors, early warning and enabling people to create their own mechanisms, preventing displacement. All of these can be and are being achieved by civilians using non-violence, using unarmed civilian protection. So you can see in this model that sort of like active, the proactive engagement, being present, and being present is a lot of how this work works. So it's not being present with a weapon, it's the active being there and accompanying people. Is part of it, but these we'll see in a minute. There's the need to build relationships, not just across the community, but with the armed actors, to dispel the myth of there being perpetrators and victims, and understanding a more connected approach to doing that, and knowing that the local communities themselves have capacity to protect, have capacity to use non-violence, and actually they're not a passive group waiting for an armed group to come in and save them. They're actually engaged in that themselves. And then the work that we're talking about in Mindanao in terms of monitoring, rather than just a watching kind of monitoring, it's an engaged way in which sort of like through the relationships you build, you actually can learn more and influence what's going on. So the work we've been doing with people that's been co-designed and carried out in Mindanao is we're asking people, the communities in Mindanao, what do you think you're doing? So what is your role and task? So rather than defining it through the what's set out in a peace agreement, we're asking people about what do you think they do? How is it that it's made safe? Are you feeling safer? And some of the interesting things are that they see both the traditional roles within their communities as well as the new ones that are being created as also being important, and the role of family and community in doing that. And also that they want to create a peace themselves, and it's not just the political violence, but also being able to tackle community violence in Rido. And this on the screen is that people in those communities are dialoguing with the armed actors. They are going up and talking to them, engaging the soldiers in conversation and asking them to not fire upon and not harm civilians. And that goes all the way through. What's evidence is that this works. Is that they are able to get involved. So this is some of the research that includes people drawing about their experience and telling the stories of it. And that in itself is empowering because people are able to exchange stories about what's happened to them and what's worked, creating a more collective action and collective knowledge and doing that. And this fits in because unarmed civilian peace protection is non-violent. Those non-violent approaches are underrepresented in security, and that if we explore it, we can influence sort of like how we're actually going to understand what protection is and how it works. In part of explaining that it really is underpinned by non-violence is Barbara Deming's work, which I love because it sort of encapsulates what we mean by underpinned by non-violence, because the people who are doing the protection work are very securely saying, like, no, we reject the harm and the violence you're going to use, but that doesn't mean we reject you. And then you reach out with humanity to ask people to recognize the humanity in one another. And that's very much how it works. It's about the changing behaviors and acknowledging that people are still important and valuable and part of their community. Accepting that armed actors can choose and their behavior that unarmed civilian peacekeeping protection, it creates the space for non-violence solutions to emerge. And talked about the sort of like that rehumanizing and recognizing humanity is part of overcoming militarism. It's part of acknowledging that people are within systems and structures, but actually that we want to move forward in such a space as creating a society in which people are all valued and included. And then again, sort of like what's really important, I think, is that we realize that if we're going to create peace, so if there's really a large global way or even a sort of community way of moving from war to peace, the means by which you achieve that peace matters. So creating a method that acknowledges that if we want a peaceful, and in terms of a just peace rather than just a lack of weapons, just peace, that actually the methods by which we want to achieve that must meet those ends. So what we're trying to do is so we've done this project very much by using participatory co-design, listening to people, and that's partly because if you want the research to be about nonviolence, using nonviolent methods and enabling people to have some ownership over that is important within the research as much. We've seen that nonviolence is used in the methods and practices they carry out in the everyday. We can see that nonviolence helps explain why unarmed civilian protection works. and it's necessary if we're going to create that long truth. So my contention really is, the argument is that if we include non-violence as a lens when we study situations or contexts of violence, it's not a counterintuitive thing to look for non-violence in sites of violence. It's actually about understanding that non-violence is present in the everyday as much as the more dominantly militarism, but actually non-violence is a way of framing what we do. Thank you.